It's time to sit back, relax, and listen to Conversations with Joan. Conversations with Joan will inspire, motivate, and empower you. Live your best life now. Listen, learn, think, and decide. And now, here's your host, Joan Herman.
Welcome to Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life's Conversations with Joan. I'm Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in. Conversations with Joan focuses on topics that are important to your life, from health and wellness to professional development to personal well-being. Change makers join me to share their insights, tips, and strategies so you can thrive and live your best life now. Thank you for taking time for yourself, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life. Now, let's start talking. Generational trauma affects mental health, relationships, and behavior, causing cycles of emotional distress and difficulty breaking harmful patterns. Today's guest, Jennifer Griffith, experienced a chaotic home life as a child, which led to poor grades, driving under the influence, and an eating disorder. She joins us today to explore generational trauma and the complexities of mother-daughter relationships. Jennifer is the host of the About Your Mother podcast and author of the book, Both Sides of Then, Finding Love After Abandonment. Welcome, Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Jennifer, I want to start off by talking a little bit about you and your story. Why are you doing the work that you're doing, and what did you experience in your life that led you to go back and examine your family story and how it shaped you?
Yes, the work I'm doing is something that's universal to all of us. It's a process that we must undertake, that to better understand our parents is to better understand ourselves. And so my process was, I always knew that my mother had a compelling life story. She was raised in an orphanage in Philadelphia after her parents died tragically. And then once she emerged in society, it was the 60s, and things had changed. And she found herself unwed and pregnant and forced to relinquish her firstborn, my brother, for adoption in the decades before Roe, where young single mothers were shamed into turning over their babies to families in the hopes that that child would have a better life. And so I knew just out of the gate that she had the cinematic life that I should write a book about, and that for many reasons, she knew her story should be told, but she didn't want to go there. She didn't want to revisit the past. Mm-hmm. So I wrote her story initially in first person through interviews that I did with her, photos, and understanding, the institutions that she was put in when she was a young girl. And in writing her story, a miraculous thing happened. I started to better understand myself. And so I was encouraged by the wonderful editor Rachel Howard to write my story as well, to go back and forth between our two voices. And in doing this process and writing the book that way, I tapped into, as I said earlier, this universal truth that our stories are so deeply connected to our mothers. And I uncovered that a lot of us, all of us can raise our hand because all of us have a mother. If you say, do you have a mother? Everybody's hands go up. But what I have found is if I ask people, well, do you know the woman she was before she became your mom? And no hands will go up in a room. And it's very rare that we understand our mothers as the woman they were before becoming our parent. But when we do this, when we take ourselves outside of our relationship with our parent and look at them as the person they were before they became our parent, a wonderful understanding happens. It's not only having empathy and acceptance for them and their role in our life, but also we better understand ourselves. And so what I did in this book is I went on this kind of wild journey of self-discovery and putting the pieces together in my childhood to have a better understanding of, as you said earlier in the introduction, why my young life was so traumatic.
I couldn't agree with you more because I had to do similar work in my life. But it's interesting because before I did that work, if someone had said to me, what was your childhood like? My response was always, it was great. I had loving parents and anything I could have wanted. But it was later in life when my life actually fell apart that I needed to go back and examine how my childhood impacted me. And so when I looked at my mother, my life was really impacted by generational trauma. And I didn't even understand that concept before. I had a 14-year-old brother who died 2 years before I was born. And so when I look at that grief that my mother went through and even experienced when I was in the womb, how that then impacted my life as I grew up. But even to take it back further, when my mother was younger, she lost a 10-year-old brother. So I started to think about all the grief that she went through and the fear that she must have had of losing me once I was born. And it just really, it revealed this story of how I became the person that I did. So when you look at your mother and all that she experienced, how do you think that impacted you later in life?
Oh, yes. Well, first of all, thank you for sharing your story, because you tapped into this thing that exactly what I tapped into, where for me, when I was a young girl, there was no way that I would look at my mom's story and say that my story was similar, because I had two parents in a home, a cat and a dog, and my mother was raised in an orphanage. How could our two stories be so similar? And what I found through writing this is, and my sister coined the phrase for me, is I lived in an emotional orphanage, that my parents were both, for reasons that I outline in the book, they were both gone by the time I was an adolescent. And so there's a saying that trauma unaddressed is trauma transferred. And because our parents' generations had a harder time talking about things, and that my mother never wanted to revisit her childhood and really go through the emotional toll and impact that it had on her, as did the relinquishment of her firstborn, what ended up happening is that shame robbed her of her voice. And there was so much shame in my house that we never talked about things. And so when I was 13 when my mother said that she had found her firstborn, my brother. And so he was 18 at the time. And so I met him when I was in my adolescence. And on the heels of that, my dad said he no longer wanted to be a part of the family. And we never talked about it, Joan. And that was the thing. So I ended up swallowing my mom's shame as well. And in some ways, losing my voice and losing my sense of agency, even though my childhood from the outside looking in looked quote unquote normal. But it was anything but, because we were living with my mother's ghosts, we were living with her pain, and eventually we were living with my father's pain. And there's a thing that happens when the room goes quiet and nobody's talking about the emotional toll that everybody's going through, it then goes inside of you. And I'm sure you experienced this as well, is that I ended up taking their pain and swallowing it. And as a young girl, going through challenges and rebellion and just being somewhat lost, because we weren't talking about what was really going on in our home. And so that is really the big impact it had on the way that I was raised.
Mm-hmm. And I became a people pleaser because somewhere along the line, I either just intuitively knew or learned that I didn't want to rock the boat and cause any more pain for my parents. So I was a good girl. I did everything everyone else wanted. I tried to please everyone else. And I carried that into my later life of my marriage, because I gave up my life for my husband and children, like so many women do. And so it's really interesting, the topic of your book and what you're talking about and teaching, because I think if every one of us look back, we all have a very similar story in different variations, but yet similar as to how we've gotten to be the person that we are.
1,000%. And for me, I thought, if I'm perfect, if I do things a certain way, if I look perfect, then my house, my family, my nuclear family will be okay. And of course, that's not going to perfectionism. On the other side of perfectionism is shame, right? And that I just ended up taking it out on myself. And to my point earlier, that's what silence does, right? When we're not talking about these or reflecting as you are suggesting, then we find ourselves in a really rough spot, because we're really not acknowledging the elephant in the room, to use a cliche. And it is when I went through this writing process that I had a much better understanding of my mother, what she was trying to do. And on the other side of forgiveness is acceptance and love. Mm-hmm. And I now accept and love her for the woman that she was and everything that she survived. And of course, for me, in my early years, there was some anger, because I knew my family didn't need to be that way. It didn't need to be so painful. And so the way I describe it is quiet. We just never talked about anything, even though these huge events were going on in our lives. Mm-hmm. And I think on the other side of this process that you're encouraging everybody to do, and that I have done and I encourage people to do as well, is really finding a place of acceptance and love, and loving the imperfect family that you have.
So when you ended up with an eating disorder, what do you believe now was behind that? Was it the feeling of not being able to control anything else, and that was the one thing you could control?
Absolutely. I mean, eating disorders are very complex and unfortunately very common. There's been so many readers that reach out to me and say, I really just identify with your experience and the way that you were taking things out on yourself. But for me, if I look at the eating disorder and I zip myself into my younger skin, I was really trying to get a sense of control when I was feeling so out of control. My two parents, they say the abandoned become the abandoners. By the time I was a teenager, when I'm walking myself into, knowing myself, it was a very dangerous time. And to have my two parents basically abandon the life that I knew it to be as a young girl, I did absolutely take it out on myself. And it was a way of punishing myself, but also a way of trying to get control. And in many ways, it did work because you do feel this sense of control, even though it's incredibly dangerous and unhealthy. And had I been getting help, I think had I been having conversations with someone, which is so much more common now for our kids to reach out and ask for help, or for us to get our kids help and have someone for them to talk to, I didn't have that. And so I really went incredibly inward in a very, self-harming, dangerous way.
What was your low point? When did you realize that you could not continue with this self-destructive behavior?
Oh, yes. The car accident. I had a little bit to drink. I ended up driving my friend's car. He had way more to drink than I did, so I thought I was making the right decision in some ways, and in a very dumb way, I thought I was making a good decision, and I clearly wasn't, and I got in a fender bender with my friend's car. But because I had a little bit to drink, I, of course, was arrested and taken into town. Now, they found out that I wasn't legally drunk. I was just under the influence. So it was reckless driving, but it really was, Joan, my low point. And it was, quite frankly, when I recorded the audiobook, the hardest chapter for me to read, because as a mother now, I was looking at my younger self and reading what I went through and just realizing, what a low point that was. Mm-hmm. But I do believe that, your breakdowns are your breakthroughs. And it was that moment in my young life where I realized I'm on my own. I'm 17 years old. I've gotten myself in trouble. This is not what I want my life to look like. And I need to do something about this. And I need to do this on my own. Mm-hmm. My parents are absent. They're going through their own trauma, and I'm watching it, but I need to save myself. And so that really was the moment. That breakdown was my breakthrough, and where I said to myself, you need to rescue yourself. You need to get yourself out of this.
When we feel the least powerful, and when we feel like we're a victim and there's really nowhere to go, that is, I believe, where we get our power. It's in that choice. It's in that decision to say, I can no longer live my life in this manner. And I think that is extremely powerful. I know in my own life, I got to a point where I was in such a dark hole that I considered taking my own life. And I had no idea how I was going to fix it. I just knew I couldn't go on another day like that. And I think that when we get to that dark moment that you described as well, that's where we find our power. It's in that little decision to say, I'm no longer going to live this way.
Oh, 1,000%. And Joan, thank you for sharing that, because I did have those moments too. I had some really, really dark thoughts where I just thought, maybe it's better for me if this is over. But you're absolutely right, because it's almost, you only have a choice in that dark moment when you're on the bathroom floor, is what I call it. I've been on the bathroom floor a couple of times, right? Mm-hmm. Feeling so desperate that that you decide you're either going to choose life or the road that you're on that has an ending very soon, right? And I think that's where clarity lives. And of course, we don't want people to all have to go through these moments, but that is where you find your strength, when you pick yourself up off the floor and you say, no more.
So when you said no more, how did you move forward? What were the baby steps that you took, and how were you able to get through all of those feelings and challenges?
Oh, that was a long one, Jo.
Yeah.
You get up and it's slow. And I want to be very clear with people. I did not heal overnight. I just made, as you did, a decision to say, okay, no more of that. I'm going to move forward in this direction. And sometimes just putting one foot in front of the other is enough. And I think we get so stuck on in this society being at the top of our game, and that's actually not what life is all about. It's about the ascent. And that some days, just like my mom, and this is something I realized writing her story, some days she was just putting one foot in front of the other. And she said to herself, okay, I survived today. I don't have parents anymore. I'm in this orphanage with strange kids. I'm moving forward, and I'm putting one foot in front of the other. And I think that healing process starts there. And then for me, there were a lot of things that really worked. Moving my body, running saved my life. Music saved my life. I grew up in Seattle in the 90s, so we had the best music, if you ask me. And Seattle rock and roll saved my life in many ways. And then writing was very healing, and therapy. And if I look at it, my sister Linda, who is the hero sister in the book, she said to me later on when we were in our 30s, 40s, that I lost 10 years. And I didn't lose 10 years, but it did take me 10 years to heal. It took me 10 years to shed that girl who thought she wasn't enough and that she deserved to feel pain versus feel joy. That was a very long journey, but one that I'm incredibly proud of, and one that I wrote about. And in the beginning, I didn't think people would want to read that story, but it turns out they do. They actually like that hero's journey that we all experience. And I think sometimes it's celebrity or, the media picks up these kind of flashy stories, but I'm more interested in the everyday person that doesn't get all the media attention, that has survived and has found ways to survive. Those are the stories that I find incredibly compelling, is, the ordinary story that is extraordinary.
Well, and stories change lives. And for me, it's been 14 years of healing. And the interesting part is it's never really over. You just have tools to learn how to take each day, one day at a time. And I learned that recently because I started to do something that I hadn't done in a very long time. And I really thought that I was on the other side of all of this. I thought I worked through it all and everything was great. And boy, when I took this new step, it brought up so many old feelings that I had to deal with again. And I think that's an important note for our listeners. You have these dark times and you learn how to move forward and you heal, but there's always something that might reignite some of those old feelings, and you just have to go back to your toolbox and work through them again. And that's perfectly normal when that happens. So don't feel defeated like, here I am again. I just think it's part of the process.
1,000%. And this is always going to be in you. And I'll share this right now. Being a mother was also, I think becoming a mother is a reckoning. Giving birth is a reckoning of sorts. And when I became a mother, I began to see the impact that my childhood had on the mother I would be to my son. And so there are a lot of times that I stop myself and I think, oh boy, I'm still working through these things, right? I'm still working through these ideas of perfectionism and things having to be a certain way for me to feel safe. And, life is messy and parenting is messy. And I have had to find a lot of grace for myself and the younger version of me that still lives within inside of me and comes out when I'm mothering. An interesting thing is when my book was released, my son was the age I was when my life fell apart. And it was really interesting to have my book emerge in the world when my son was my age, at the age I'm writing about when my family fell apart. And I look at him and I think, oh my gosh, he's so young. I was so young when I went through all of that. And so to your point, yes, this lives on, and it's a lifetime journey and recognition of the experiences that you had when you were young that shaped the person you are today. And it's a lifelong work and process, but one that, as you share, is really beautiful when we start to put the pieces together.
Jennifer, what advice do you offer to help someone who's going through a dark period right now?
Oh, to move your body. That's one thing that I always say to someone is, if you're having a hard time, get up and move. It is really something that saved my life, just because it can change your physiology so quickly. But the other thing is, I think for all of us, we have so many things that we want to pursue, so many dreams, and dreams don't have an expiration date. We have these concepts of when things are supposed to happen, but they can happen anytime. And so I encourage people to write down the things, if you're in a dark place, write down the things that are important to you or that you want to achieve, and pick one and make 15 minutes a day set aside 15 minutes a day of inspired time to do something that is going to fill your bucket up. And it's really when I started opening doors to myself and this long healing journey that I went on, and taking on new things and trying new things and doing things that were really important to me, that I started to feel better and I started to feel empowered.
The book is Both Sides of Then, Finding Love After Abandonment. Jennifer, where can our listeners go if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Oh, yes. So my website is by Jennifer Griffith, byjennifergriffith.com. And on there I have resources about reflections on your family and the work that I did. I kind of template the process that I went through in writing my book. My podcast is available there. And then all of my social media handles are by Jennifer Griffith as well.
Jennifer, in about 30 seconds or less, what's the takeaway? What would you like to leave our listeners with?
Oh, we all have a story to tell, and they all matter. And it is the everyday life that we live, that messy, imperfect life that we live, that has value and that should be shared. And when you share your story, a miraculous thing happens. You start to hear from others, just like we shared today on your show. You start to hear how connected we are in our stories. And although they look very different on the outside sometimes, in the end, we're all going through the same thing together. And when we share our stories, that's when we build community. And that's really what I want to encourage people to do. I don't necessarily suggest everyone write a memoir. That's not for everybody. But find those people that you can talk to about your story. And that's where connection comes from. And that's how we feel whole, is being connected to one another. I don't think there's a period in our lives where it hasn't been more important than it is today to share our stories and to see the power in our narratives and build community around those.
Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. It was lovely.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you found the show informative. At Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life, we believe that knowledge is power. Take what you've learned, apply it, and live your best life now. Remember that the information provided is the opinion of our guest and should never replace the advice of a professional who knows your personal situation. If you'd like more information, visit our website, CYACYL.com. That stands for Change Your Attitude, Change Your Life. While on the site, listen to past shows on demand, read our digital articles, and be sure to subscribe to our mailing list. Until next time, this is Joan Herman. Thanks for tuning in.